Not so fast. Alright, let's talk about nuclear energy. On the surface, it looks like the perfect answer to our climate change prayers. You have a power source that can generate massive amounts of electricity 24/7 without spewing out the greenhouse gases that are currently turning our planet into a slow cooker. Proponents will show you impressive charts and graphs, pointing out that during operation, a nuclear power plant is cleaner than a whistle. They'll tell you it's the reliable, muscular backbone we need to support a grid increasingly reliant on the sometimes fickle nature of wind and solar. It's the grown-up in the room of renewable energy, the one that doesn't go to sleep just because the sun does. This is the sales pitch, and it's a compelling one. We are, after all, in a desperate race against time. The idea of a powerful, carbon-free energy source is incredibly seductive. Countries around the world, spooked by volatile fossil fuel prices and the ever louder alarm bells of climate scientists, are taking a second look at nuclear. They see it as a pragmatic solution, a bridge to a greener future. The argument is simple. If we're serious about decarbonization, can we really afford to ignore any tool in the toolbox, especially one that packs such a powerful punch? It all sounds so logical, so sensible, so straightforward, which is usually the exact moment you should start getting suspicious. The problem is, focusing only on the clean operation of a nuclear plant is like judging a hot dog contest by only looking at the eating part and ignoring how the hot dogs are made. The reality of nuclear energy is a sprawling, complicated, and legally treacherous journey that starts long before the lights go on and continues long after they've gone out. It involves mining, enrichment, transportation, and a waste problem so persistent it makes a cockroach infestation look like a temporary inconvenience. Each step is wrapped in a thick blanket of regulations, international treaties, and environmental laws, many of which are confusing, contradictory, or just plain inadequate for the task at hand. So, while the promise of clean, reliable power is tempting, we have to look at the whole picture. It's a picture filled with hidden costs, immense risks, and ethical dilemmas that we've been kicking down the road for decades. The legal and environmental hurdles are not just minor speed bumps. They are mountainous obstacles that make the nuclear path far more difficult and dangerous than its advocates would have you believe. Before we sign up for this supposed clean energy miracle, we need to read the terms and conditions, and trust me, the fine print is an absolute horror show. It's a story of legal loopholes, environmental nightmares, and a price tag that could make a billionaire weep. Let's start at the beginning of the nuclear story, getting the fuel. This isn't like picking up a bag of charcoal at the local supermarket. It begins with uranium mining, an activity that is, to put it mildly, incredibly messy. Uranium ore is often found in places that are environmentally sensitive or on the lands of indigenous communities who, shockingly, aren't thrilled about having their ancestral homes turned into radioactive quarries. The process of extracting and milling uranium creates enormous piles of toxic waste called tailings. These tailings can leak radioactive materials and heavy metals into the soil and groundwater for thousands of years, creating a permanent environmental scar. The legal framework governing this is a patchwork of national mining laws and environmental regulations that often fail to protect local ecosystems and populations. Once you've got the uranium, you can't just pop it into a reactor. It needs to be enriched, a process that separates the useful uranium-235 isotope from the more common uranium-238. This process is not only energy-intensive, which slightly undermines the whole clean energy claim, but it also creates more radioactive waste, including depleted uranium. Here's where the legal side gets spicy. The technology used for enrichment is highly sensitive because the same process can be used to create highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. This means the entire industry is subject to intense international scrutiny and a web of non-proliferation treaties. But these laws are only as good as their enforcement, and the risk of materials falling into the wrong hands is a constant, terrifying shadow hanging over the entire industry. After enrichment, the fuel has to be fabricated into fuel rods and then transported to power plants. Think about that for a second. We are regularly shipping weapons-grade adjacent material across our highways, railways, and seas. Each shipment is a potential target for theft or an opportunity for a catastrophic accident. The regulations for this are, as you'd expect, incredibly strict, but they vary from country to country, creating a complex and sometimes confusing legal maze for international shipments. An accident involving a shipment of nuclear fuel could have devastating environmental consequences and trigger a legal nightmare of cross-border liability claims, a situation for which the international legal system is woefully unprepared. So, before we even get to a power plant, we've already created a trail of environmental damage from mining, produced more radioactive waste from enrichment, and navigated a legal and security labyrinth just to move the fuel around. The clean part of nuclear energy seems to be skipping a few chapters of the story. This front end of the fuel cycle is a perfect example of how the problems with nuclear are systemic. They are embedded in the very process of creating the fuel, long before a single watt of electricity is generated. It's a messy, risky, and legally complicated business from the very start. Now for the big one. The issue that has haunted the nuclear industry since its inception, the waste. After a few years in a reactor, nuclear fuel rods are no longer efficient but are terrifyingly radioactive. This high-level waste is a cocktail of deadly materials that will remain dangerous for, and this is not a typo, hundreds of thousands of years. To put that in perspective, the pyramids of Giza are about 4,500 years old. We are creating garbage that will outlast human civilization as we know it. And here's the kicker. After more than 70 years of civilian nuclear power, no country on Earth has a permanent disposal solution in operation. Not one. This isn't for a lack of trying. Scientists have proposed burying it deep underground in stable geological formations. The most famous attempt was the Yucca Mountain Repository in the United States, a project that consumed decades of research and billions of dollars before it was effectively canceled due to intense political opposition and geological concerns. The legal problem here is enormous. How can you write a law that guarantees the safety of a site for 200,000 years? What government, what institution, what legal entity can you possibly trust to maintain oversight for a span of time that makes empires look like fleeting thoughts? The legal concept of perpetual care is a fantasy when dealing with such timescales. This leaves us with a truly terrible temporary solution. Most spent nuclear fuel is currently stored on site at the power plants where it was used, either in steel-lined concrete pools of water or in massive concrete and steel containers called dry casks. These are essentially parking lots for the most dangerous material on the planet. This raises a huge legal question. Who is responsible for this waste in the long run? When a nuclear plant is decommissioned after its 40 or 60-year lifespan, the waste remains. The private companies that ran the plants might go bankrupt or cease to exist, leaving the government, and by extension the taxpayers, to foot the bill for safeguarding this forever poison for millennia. The lack of a permanent solution creates a state of legal limbo. In many countries, the law simply states that the government is ultimately responsible for the final disposal of nuclear waste, without any concrete plan for how or when that will happen. This vague promise has allowed the industry to operate for decades, privatizing the profits while socializing the long-term risk and cost. It's the ultimate example of passing the buck, except this buck is glowing and will kill you. The unresolved issue of nuclear waste isn't just a technical challenge, it's a profound legal and ethical failure. If you think dealing with nuclear waste sounds like a headache, try building a new nuclear power plant. This is not a weekend DIY project. The process is a marathon of legal, regulatory, and financial hurdles that can stretch on for a decade or more. Before you can even break ground, you need to navigate a labyrinth of permits and licenses. This involves extensive environmental impact assessments, geological surveys to ensure the site is stable, and public consultations that can become battlegrounds for local opposition. Every step is scrutinized by regulators, environmental groups, and concerned citizens, and any misstep can lead to years of costly legal challenges and delays. The sheer complexity of the regulations is staggering. A modern nuclear plant is one of the most complex machines ever built, and the rules governing its design, construction, and operation are appropriately dense. These regulations are constantly evolving, especially in the wake of accidents like Fukushima. This means a plant that was designed to meet the standards of, say, 2025 might have to be retrofitted to meet the new, tougher standards of 2030, all while it's still under construction. This regulatory ratcheting can cause budgets to balloon and timelines to stretch into infinity. It's like trying to build a plane while the engineers are still arguing about how wings work. This long and unpredictable construction timeline is a financial killer. Nuclear power plants have astronomical upfront costs, often running into the tens of billions of dollars. Because they take so long to build, they are incredibly sensitive to interest rates and inflation. A project that seemed financially viable at the start can become an economic black hole by the time it's finished. The Vogtle plant in Georgia, for instance, ended up costing more than double its original estimate and was completed years behind schedule. This financial risk is so great that private investors are often unwilling to touch these projects without massive government loan guarantees, effectively transferring the risk from the company to the taxpayer. Furthermore, the legal landscape itself can change dramatically over the course of a decade-long construction project. A new government might come into power with a different energy policy, or a major court ruling could alter the interpretation of environmental laws. This political and legal instability adds another layer of risk, making it incredibly difficult to plan and execute such a massive undertaking. Building a nuclear power plant is not just an engineering challenge, it's a high-stakes gamble against time, money, and the shifting sands of the law. It's a process so fraught with peril that it's a wonder any of them ever get built at all. Let's address the elephant in the room: accidents. While the nuclear industry correctly points out that, statistically, it is a very safe way to generate power, the consequences of a major accident are so catastrophic that they defy normal risk assessment. Events like Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011 are not just industrial accidents, they are world-changing disasters with environmental and human costs that last for generations. A single meltdown can render vast swaths of land uninhabitable, force the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people, and cause long-term health effects like cancer and genetic damage. The environmental contamination from fallout can spread across continents, poisoning soil, water, and the entire food chain. The legal fallout from such an accident is almost as devastating as the radioactive fallout. Who is liable? The scale of the damage from a major nuclear accident can easily exceed the financial capacity of any private company. To address this, most countries are signatories to international conventions, like the Paris and Vienna Conventions, which create a special legal regime for nuclear liability. These treaties do two main things. First, they channel all legal liability exclusively to the operator of the nuclear plant, protecting suppliers and contractors. Second, and more controversially, they cap the amount of money the operator has to pay out. This cap is typically far below the actual cost of a disaster. Think about what that means. The legal system, which is supposed to provide justice and compensation, has a built-in get-out-of-jail cheap card for the nuclear industry. After the Fukushima disaster, the cleanup costs, compensation claims, and economic losses were estimated to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The operator TEPCO was protected by a liability cap that was a tiny fraction of that amount. The rest of the cost? It fell on the Japanese government, which is to say the Japanese taxpayers. This legal framework essentially acts as a massive, hidden subsidy for the nuclear industry, shielding it from the true financial consequences of its own potential failures. Beyond the financial costs, the human toll creates legal and ethical dilemmas that are nearly impossible to resolve. How do you compensate someone for being forced from their ancestral home forever? What is the monetary value of a lifetime of anxiety about developing cancer? The court cases that follow a nuclear disaster can drag on for decades, with victims fighting for recognition and compensation against powerful corporate and state interests. The legal system struggles to grapple with the long-term, transgenerational nature of the harm caused by radiation exposure. It's a grim reminder that when things go wrong with nuclear power, the consequences are so profound that our legal structures are simply not equipped to handle them. The story of nuclear energy is inextricably linked with the story of indigenous peoples, and it is largely a story of injustice. From the very beginning of the nuclear age, uranium mining has disproportionately taken place on or near indigenous lands. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, vast reserves of uranium were found in territories belonging to communities like the Navajo Nation, the Dean people, and various Aboriginal groups. These communities were often subjected to high-pressure tactics and offered deals that grossly undervalued their resources while ignoring the long-term environmental and health consequences of the mining operations. The legacy of this mining is one of profound environmental devastation and public health crises. For decades, mining companies operated with lax, apathetic oversight, leaving behind thousands of abandoned uranium mines and mills. These sites continue to contaminate the land, air, and water with radioactive materials and heavy metals. For communities that rely on the land for their subsistence, culture, and spirituality, This is a catastrophic blow. The health consequences have been tragic, with elevated rates of kidney disease, lung cancer, and other illnesses linked to radiation exposure. The legal fight for cleanup and compensation has been a long and arduous one, with communities often lacking the resources to take on powerful corporations and governments. The issue of nuclear waste disposal also poses a severe threat to indigenous rights. As governments search for a place to dump their forever waste, they often look to remote, sparsely populated areas. Unsurprisingly, these are often the same lands that are home to indigenous communities. The proposed repository at Yucca Mountain, for example, is located on land sacred to the Western Shoshone people, who consider it a place of deep spiritual significance. For them, the plan to bury nuclear waste there is not just an environmental issue, it is an act of profound cultural and spiritual desecration. Their legal and political opposition was a key factor in the project's demise. This pattern of targeting indigenous lands for the most dangerous parts of the nuclear fuel cycle represents a modern form of colonialism. It imposes the risks of nuclear energy on vulnerable populations who receive few, if any, of the benefits. International legal principles, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, call for free, prior, and informed consent before any projects affecting their lands and resources can proceed. However, the history of the nuclear industry is littered with examples where this principle has been ignored. It's a stark reminder that the clean energy produced in a distant city often comes at a heavy, dirty price for someone else. So, after wading through the legal and environmental swamp of nuclear power, what's the alternative? Well, it turns out there's a much simpler, safer, and increasingly cheaper option: renewables. Solar, wind, geothermal, and hydropower present a stark contrast to the complexities of nuclear energy. For starters, their fuel source, sunlight, wind, heat from the earth, is free, abundant, and doesn't require a global supply chain fraught with security risks. There is no mining for sunshine, no enrichment of the breeze, and no transportation of potentially weaponizable materials. This alone eliminates a huge swath of the legal and regulatory headaches that plague the nuclear industry. From an environmental standpoint, the difference is night and day. While the manufacturing of solar panels and wind turbines does have an environmental footprint, it pales in comparison to the legacy of uranium mining and the unsolvable problem of nuclear waste. Renewable energy projects can be decommissioned and recycled. A solar farm can be removed and the land can be restored. You cannot do that with a site contaminated by a nuclear meltdown or a repository filled with high-level waste that will be deadly for 100,000 years. The legal liability for renewables is finite and manageable, dealing with things like land use and construction impacts, not the mind-boggling challenge of perpetual stewardship over a radioactive tomb. Many countries have already demonstrated that a transition to a green economy is possible without relying on the high risks of nuclear power. Look at Germany's Energiewende, or energy transition. Despite phasing out its nuclear plants after the Fukushima disaster, Germany has become a world leader in renewable energy, which now accounts for a massive share of its electricity production. Similarly, countries like Denmark have built a grid heavily reliant on wind power. These examples show that the argument that we need nuclear for a stable, carbon-free grid is simply not true. A smart combination of different renewable sources, paired with energy storage solutions and grid improvements, can provide reliable power. In the end, the choice becomes clearer. While nuclear energy offers the tempting promise of immense power, it comes with a package of legal, environmental, and ethical problems that are as persistent as its waste. The risks of accidents, the burden on indigenous communities, the astronomical costs and delays, and the unresolved liability issues make it a deeply flawed solution. Renewables, on the other hand, offer a more democratic, resilient, and environmentally sound path forward. They are faster to deploy, less risky, and their costs are continuing to fall. For many experts, policymakers, and nations, the debate is settling. The future of clean energy looks less like a cooling tower and more like a field of solar panels and wind turbines.